genocides and political atrocities take place, it has become common for people to assemble in public, bear witness to what has happened, and address those events to reach a sense of what exactly? Awareness, truth, understanding, closure, reconciliation, healing, reparation, change? And if these or something else are the aims of these assemblies, do they actually achieve these goals? Enter Jane Barter and her new book, Theopolitics and the Era of Witness, to explore these and so many other important questions related to a phenomenon that has become so typical of our time that it's rare to encounter people thinking as deeply and speaking as meaningfully to these questions as Jane does. In fact, in the lead up to this conversation, I was reminded of a story Jacques Ellul tells in Volume 1 of his prologue to Christian Ethics, To Will and to Do. It captures some of the many difficult and tragic complexities surrounding the public trial of Adolf Eichmann after the Holocaust, which Jane also analyzes in her book. Here's what Ellul writes, quote, "An example, at once tragic and clear, is afforded by the debate which took place on the subject of the condemnation of Eichmann. It is obvious that from the point of view of the survival of the human community, from the point of view of civil justice, as from the point of view of the natural human sentiments, Eichmann should have been condemned to death. For as was said, to let a murderer go free is completely to overthrow the principles of justice and the laws of civilization. But over against that, a Christian conscience has to ask whether pardon is a purely individual matter, or whether it also concerns collective crimes, and whether pardon should not involve Eichmann's release. That idea was maintained by M. Golantz, writing as follows, 6 million human beings have been killed, but what good does it do to kill one more? Will this action rip away the veil of hate and cruelty which Auschwitz has thrown over humanity? Eichmann belongs to God, and only God can judge him. We should not be guided by the mythical idea of compensatory justice, but by that of spiritual compensation, which is closer to us. The more hateful the evil has been, the greater the mercy must be. The extreme wickedness of Hitler demands an extreme act of goodness. Only mercy and forgetting can bring a little light into our darkness." And Golantz concluded with the suggestion that Eichmann be set free with this injunction, "Go and sin no more." It is obvious, Ellul observes, that the application of that morality would be disastrous for collective life, but it is no less obvious that it corresponds to the requirement of love of neighbor, or more exactly, the love of one's enemy. Here can be seen the contradiction, and we should note with melancholy humor that the morality of civil justice was sustained by a Dominican father, and that the morality of love of neighbor in God was sustained by an Israelite. In short, such assemblies and trials are needed, but they are fraught, and the work of people like Ellul and Jane help us navigate such fraught territory. And so with that, here's my conversation with Jane. Welcome to Personalist Manifesto's Jane Barter. How's it going today?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I got my peppermint tea, and it's quiet in the office, and I think the day is shaping up well. But you're a little bit ahead, right? There's a time difference, so you can say with more certainty how the day is going.
Well, it's just afternoon right now, so yes, so far so good in Winnipeg.
Awesome. Well, thanks for making time to talk about your new book. Before we get into this new book, Theopolitics and the End of Witness, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Jane Barter? What do folks need to know about you?
They really don't need to know anything about me, except that I wrote this book. That's probably the only thing that's kind of interesting. But no, I am a professor of religion and culture at the University of Winnipeg. I've been teaching there for about 20 years or so, though I am trained as a theologian. And this book came out of thinking about and wrestling with questions about memory and witnessing for as long as I can remember. In a way, I remember being in my PhD and thinking through questions about this, but I wasn't ready to write it until much later.
how did you end up in theology? This is an interesting question to me that I always ask theologians
Mhm.
because I don't know very many people who, when they're younger, say, I want to be a theologian when I grow up. So, what was your journey towards theology and the type of theology that you do, that you would be doing your doctoral research, thinking about politics, witness, and these sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. It changes every year when I think about this question. Like, why the heck am I a theologian? It seems like an unlikely choice in many ways for a lot of people, and especially for me. But I grew up in rural Nova Scotia and a relatively economically deprived part of Nova Scotia and time within Nova Scotian um, politics and economy. And the opportunities that were presented to me when I think about it were relatively few, except for in the church. So this is contrary to most of my students' experiences. But in the church, I grew up in the United Church, and it was the place where I learned about LGBTQ rights, where I learned the word feminism, where I learned about the struggle for anti apartheid. And in retrospect, that was probably the stuff that was most intriguing to me. And it was the vehicle for thinking about matters of social justice and politics. And so I continued on with theology, thinking that I would get to be a political radical. And that, of course, was not necessarily the case in seminary, although I'm very grateful for my theological training in many ways because it helped me to think through a lot of the kinds of questions that I find interesting still. The relationship between religion and politics, how or how theology rather funds our politics, intellectually, imaginatively, and so on. So that is basically how I grew up in rural Nova Scotia, and I went to the United Church, and it gave me an outlet for my political awakening.
That is a story that you don't often hear from
Yeah,
folks
I know.
um, in North America who are Christian. And it's funny because I've talked about this on the show before, but I actually also grew up in a mainline liberal Protestant home. But that's what I grew up in, and my dad being in public education, my mom being a clinical counselor. I was formed in such a way that there is a social and political consciousness there that I realize was a gift to me and really shaped me early on and continues to shape me now.
Mhm.
And hearing the stories of some of my friends, I realized how unique of a gift that was. And I've actually talked about this too. I didn't think about it at the time. Like, my parents never used the word mainline liberal Protestants, but that's precisely what they were, and that's what they are
Mm,
today. And I
mhm.
remember just saying to them, like, just a year ago, like, you raised me in a mainline liberal Protestant home, didn't you? And they're like, yeah, we did. But it wasn't this like self-conscious thing. And honestly, like, I just seen what some of my friends have gone through who have been raised in more of like the fundamentalist evangelicalism. I realized how many bullets I dodged. Like, not even just theologically, but also, like, I got to listen to good music, and I was allowed to read Harry Potter and, like, go to movies, and it was just I was like, "Wow," I feel like I've been able to weather this massive wave of deconstruction, storms, just like I'm mixing metaphors now, because my my experience in the faith growing up just wasn't as damaging as I think a lot of people have had. So it's
Mhm.
just nice to meet another Canadian, theologian who has a similar background. So you talk about theology funding politics, and I recall at the start of the book you make the point that you're not calling this political theology, you're calling this theopolitics. Do you want to describe why it is you make that statement? Because I feel like that's operating in the background of what you're saying in terms of your theological education and your thinking about the relationship between politics and theology.
Mhm. Thanks for that question. So when I think about political theology, the name Carl Schmitt comes immediately to mind, and I want to be critical of Carl Schmitt, not only because he was a Nazi jurist, but also because Carl Schmitt's conception of the way in which theology works in politics and their relationship has to do with, I think he said something to the effect that all political concepts are foundationally theological concepts, right? So, first of all, he's looking at this kind of unidirectional flow from theology that gets translated into the secular world, into political ideals. And for him, that's particularly the concept of sovereignty. So, how does sovereignty play out? Well, secular sovereignty echoes what was ancient, theocentric kind of sovereignty. And so the problem with that is it's focused upon, these kind of rigid concepts like sovereignty. It's unidirectional in nature. But also, it doesn't look at the ways in which theology is also influenced by political life. And so I think it's a bit more of a hermeneutical circle than a unidirectional flow. And also in the book, I make the argument that it's not just concepts like these stagnant concepts that Schmidt would have, like sovereignty, but it's actually practices as well. So I'm looking at witnessing in this book, and I see witnessing as a practice that we undertake politically in the aftermath of atrocity, which is what I'm writing about, but it has echoes of other practices, more ancient practices within the theological world. And so theopolitics goes both ways. And it's more about practices, and it's also not about sovereignty, but about the underside of sovereignty, those who are oppressed, those who are vulnerable, those who offer a kind of theology that comes from the underside of history rather than the overlords of history.
Yeah. Yeah. And in focusing on the practices, you're getting into the rituals and some might say liturgies of politics, even just as politics, right? And so this is one of the things that I often say when people talk about our so-called secular age, because often the suggestion is we've somehow moved beyond religion, that we've moved beyond belief, moved beyond transcendence. And I don't think that that's what Charles Taylor was necessarily getting at. It's just the supernova effect of Christendom sort of imploding results in all manner of spiritualities and senses of the transcendent and rituals and so forth. But politics seems to be a pretty strong religion with liturgies and rituals and practices, and paying closer attention to those practices and what's happening and how actually religious and theological language creeps in is telling us something about precisely what you're getting at is um, it it it's all too easy for theology to just be subordinated towards politics, even when you're thinking about you're doing political theology, and then it risks moving into the territory of idolatry and the dangers that come with it. Um, Going back to your PhD research, though, you said you were thinking about witness at that time. What was it about your PhD research that got you thinking about this?
Well, I didn't end up writing on memory so much, although maybe obliquely. I ended up writing on George Lindbeck and post-liberalism and trying to do a kind of pneumatological correction to that. So it was a rather different project. But I do remember, thinking about December 6, 1989, the Montreal Massacre, and writing about that in some of my research papers, and the way in which that event was memorialized and became symbolic for, the entire feminist movement. And the kind of violence that did to the actual memories, the concrete memories of those 14 women who were gunned down. And at a certain point, the family members said, okay, well, enough already. We don't want to go through this liturgy every year where our daughters' names are remembered in such a way, not because they were against necessarily like the feminist use of it, but just that it was so painful for them personally to be thinking about that. And I spent a lot of time in my master's thesis, actually, I wrote on Paul Ricoeur. And so his magnum opus was on memory. And that also got me thinking about some of these questions early on, but I wasn't ready to address them too much later, obviously.
Yeah, I can see the linkages though with Paul Ricoeur on memory, and then Lindbeck, of course, looking a lot at practices, right? And so those two linking up to set you up to what you're doing in this book. I found it really helpful to understand a common practice in response to mass, tragedies. We just take for granted that there is going to be some kind of ceremony to acknowledge what happened, to memorialize, and then as time, goes on, remember. Well, and all of that is bearing witness to this tragedy that happened. And we just kind of assume that that's what you do, right? And whenever there's that assumption, it actually can have, yeah, positives, but it can also have very real negatives. And I think that's what's so helpful about your book is you're saying, okay, let's actually look at some examples. You talked about the Montreal Massacre and others, and try to understand what people were thinking when they organized this ceremony or liturgy in this way to acknowledge suffering. And where's the light side, but where's the shadow side of it? And I think we need that today, especially within not even just like mass media, but social media. Is like, how do we faithfully remember tragedies, memorialize them, and bear witness to them in a way that doesn't result in more tragedy? Actually reminded me of, there's one essay that I read in my undergrad that has stuck with me all these years, is Adorno's essay on remembrance, how to remember well after the Holocaust. And he goes through all of these different ways in which people have tried to remember it faithfully, and he works through the strengths of those approaches, but also the very real weaknesses and dangers of them. And that's, if I remember correctly, that is where you start actually. And you refer to the Holocaust as the Shoah for very intentional reasons, but that might be a good place to start in sort of giving people an idea of the theories that you're engaging, the theologies you're doing, but some of the very tangible case studies, as it were, to work those theologies and theories out in real time.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. Like in a way, the Shoah is paradigmatic of what happens when we remember well and when we remember poorly. And so much of the ways in which we bear witness to atrocity has been shaped by Holocaust remembrance, right? So I begin the book talking about the lament, and I'm talking about theological concepts of lament. Going back to biblical concepts of lament in the Psalms and in Lamentations and so on, but also within Jewish theology, Jewish theologies within the 20th century. And I'm looking at some of those very early writings of Shoah survivors. And I look at Paul Celan and Primo Levi as rather exemplary because, these are survivors. They're writing about their own narratives. There's not a lot of redaction that's going on yet of their narratives. They're writing directly about their stories and about the people that they remember in the camps, particularly Levy in that case, who's writing kind of an expository memoir. And my argument is that they do something very much like lament, and that is they stay very close to the characters themselves, like to the event itself. There's not a lot of, talking about the future or postulating about the future or the meaning of the event. In other words, there's no theodicy. And it's not given over to a kind of redemptive futurity. I mean, if you think about what lamentation is biblically, it's a kind of lived protest against the injustice that the people of God have faced. And as such, it's a political act. Like, this should never have happened. God, why did you allow this to happen, right? And to me, this is what's going on in these narratives, which are not necessarily religious narratives and poems, which are not necessarily religious, but they're talking about, the travesty of what has happened, and they're not trying to reconcile it to some sort of redeemed future. And to me, that's a very hopeful way, promising way of bearing witness. What happens a little bit later, and here I take the Eichmann trial of 1961, is that the stories of survivors is utilized in order to bear witness within the context of a trial that's taking place in Jerusalem. And it's a trial in which the narratives are used in order to prop up the state of Israel. So if you listen to Hausner's arguments, closing arguments, he talks about anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism being a struggle that is perennial and that has only one solution. The only way we can overcome the suffering of these witnesses is through a strong ethno-nationalist nation state. And to me, that's a very different way of bearing witness. Now, it's not necessarily the intent of those who are bearing witness that this would take place, but the redaction of a Hausner is something that takes those stories and turns them into a theodicy. Very different from lament, And then the characters who are bearing witness become martyrs. They were martyrs who, suffered for the sake of Jewish futurity.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one thing that just in our back and forth in prep for this conversation, I mentioned was that what you said just there and how you elaborate on it in your book helped me realize that systematic responses to the problem of evil and suffering, or theodicy, forecloses the possibility of lament.
Mm-hmm.
And not just individually when tragedy strikes, or not just at like a local church level where a church is engaging in the practices of lament, although how many churches actually do is a whole other question. But even when you talk about these assemblies that get together to talk about the tragedy that has happened and share stories and to bear witness, and then the discourse that is added onto it to somehow provide a sense of closure, a sense of redemption or meaning, and how that is used for an agenda of some sort, right? So like you said, it's a falsely redemptive future. And what's so beautiful about A Turn Towards Lament is to say, lament so often doesn't end saying, there's no hope, or God, you're not here. Like there is usually, the beginning and middle is expressing that feeling of abandonment, that feeling of fear, that feeling of despair. It often resolves though in a, nevertheless, you have done this in the past, and I hope that you will be doing something like that in the present and the future. But it's leaving space rightfully for God to make apparent how God is present and possibly bringing redemption into the situation, which without having to force an ending, and definitely not trying to turn what has just been disclosed into something to justify an agenda. And in a lot of cases, like you said, a very dangerous one at that. I was actually struck just by how brutal some of the language was and how sort of blood-soaked it is, and the tragic irony of taking time to acknowledge the persecution of peoples, to bear witness to it, to grieve it, but then also within that sort of opening up of space to address real trauma, the foundations are laid for the perpetuation of future trauma.
Yeah, I mean, the Holocaust is evoked, the Shoah is evoked all the time right now by the state of Israel to justify the genocide of the Palestinian people,
Mm-hmm.
for example.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And you key in on the phrase "never again," right? And what lengths will a people or a nation go to ensure never again for themselves, but not for others?
Yeah, precisely.
You also get into trauma theory.
Mhm.
And what I appreciated about the way that you use trauma theory in your work is you do talk about it in the way that it's often spoken about as like traumatized individuals, but you also move it to the communal forms of trauma, social forms of trauma. And I think that's really helpful because I, as someone who reads a lot in trauma theory, trauma theology, and so forth, it's not altogether wrong, but there is an emphasis on the effect that trauma has on the individual. But you moving it to a more social level, I think, is also really helpful to say we also need to be paying attention to the larger systems and structures and practices and liturgies that are bringing to light trauma maybe, but also perpetuating it as well. So do you want to speak to what you're doing there? Because I think that's really helpful for people to hear about.
Hmm. Yeah, in some ways, I'm rather critical of the ubiquity of trauma. We talk about trauma, I think, without a lot of accounting for the actual material differences between the degree to which people are traumatized, right? So, for example, I could talk about, my trauma growing up because of XYZ, but that would be very different from the trauma of a person in, say, Sudan right now or Palestine right now, right? And so, what I find difficult about the turn toward trauma is its ubiquity. And where I talk about this, I begin with a story in which the Michael Pierce apologizes to IRS survivors, Indigenous residential school survivors. This great moment of apology, and I think a heartfelt one. But he talks about his emphasis is about the ways in which he is wounded and how he is in need of healing, right? And what I find interesting about that is that trauma, unlike, say, what we were talking about just a moment ago with the Shoah, nobody's going to ever think about, like, let's think about the Nazis' trauma. But something happens between then and this more recent turn where trauma becomes ubiquitous. So it's not only the survivor's trauma, but it's also the witness to the survivor's trauma. And sometimes even it's the perpetrator's trauma, right? That becomes something that is examined and has to be confessed and has to be renounced and overcome and so on in this whole liturgy, as you say, this political liturgy of confession and reconciliation. And so what I find difficult about that is the way in which trauma is often placed on display. And we think that it's enough for us to articulate the trauma of victims and the sorrow of the perpetrator, and somehow that is going to advance reconciliation without any actual material reparations being made, right? And so Diane Million, who's a brilliant Athabascan scholar, writes a book called Therapeutic Nations, in which she talks about the TRC as a moment within Canadian history in which Indigenous trauma is on display, through these public liturgies, which are, the TRC events.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, the nation state believes that is going to resolve the problems. So rather looking at the material disparities between Indigenous people here in Canada and non-Indigenous people, there's instead this liturgy which is somehow going to overcome the shame of the residential schools and ongoing colonization and lead us to a new day in which trauma is overcome simply by speaking it. And I'm looking at sort of the theological register in which that takes place, and I argue that has a lot to do with, older Christian paradigms about public confession, renunciation, apology, redress, and repentance and reconciliation.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember actually we were both at the same conference, the Canadian Theological Society, and there was conversation about land acknowledgements. And there's a fellow, I didn't catch his name, but he said, land acknowledgements are all well and good, but maybe we could actually just give some land back.
Yeah.
right? And I think that's one way of articulating what you're saying here, is that confession is a helpful first step. But confession without reparation is so um, likely to just become political performance,
Mhm,
right? It's like
mhm.
greenwashing or ethics washing, right? It's like confession washing past and present harms without commitment to making something right.
Well, and going back to your comment about individual trauma versus collective trauma, Diane Million would say that this display, the spectacle of Indigenous trauma, really is a colonial apparatus. So we listen to survivors' stories. The stories are recounted in a certain kind of way. We have this kind of therapeutic event that's taking place, presumably. But what it does is it casts Indigenous people as these perennial wounded victims rather than full agents. And it also enables, these Western kinds of interventions in their lives. So she's doing a biopolitical analysis of the ways in which populations are controlled through rendering them a traumatized subject. So all of these mediating institutions, mental health care kinds of institutions, which we think are benign, have this relationship to carcerality that she wants to unpack, right? If we're controlling Indigenous populations by by presuming that they're traumatized victims.
Right. So in this particular context, what would you like if you were to envision a more constructive and helpful way to approach past and present systems that just perpetuate these wounds and this trauma? What would you envision?
Economic redistribution,
Hmm.
land back, Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah. And the degree to which you get the response, well, surely we can't do that, shows you just how
Yeah.
thin the confessions and the performances are.
Correct. So it's very interesting because in 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper made this public apology about, as a result of the class action suit about residential schools. And for him, it was uncharacteristically emotional. I am sorry. I am sorry. I'm sorry. He says a gazillion times, this is the man who shook his kid's hand before he left him for school, right? So this is not a very affective person, but he used a very affective language in this apology. It's made, and then he goes on to have one of the worst track records in terms of Indigenous sovereignty and land claims and protection of resources of any prime minister. Like no sooner had he made the apology than there's all of this erosion of Indigenous gains. So I think that's quite predictable, actually.
Yeah, and in a way, it's almost more galling to perform the apology and then do the exact opposite of what your emotional apology is trying to communicate than it is just, why don't you just be honest with like people that you just don't care? Like
Yeah,
it would just then people could be aware of the risks and the realities as compared to being given false hope.
right, right. And it's very interesting because I think this goes back to a moment within the history of penitence in which, it used to be you would repent of your sins against your neighbor by reparations. You stole your neighbor's lamb, you return the lamb, right? That sort of thing. But something somewhere around the ninth century, there was this idea that if you confess your sins, before a priest about your sins against a neighbor, all that was required was your remorse. Your remorse itself was, and signs of your remorse was itself considered to be penitence and sufficient, right? And we carry that on because we believe that these emotional displays are in some way efficacious to create like this new situation, this harmonized relationship between the guilty and the offended. But that's of course is not the case.
No, not at all. And I just have so many images in my head and stories that I've read and heard and even witnessed myself, within the context of domestic abuse and how it's handled in the church, right? Um, the the displays that are put on, or even when noteworthy pastors uh have a moral failing, and then there's the public performance of confessing in a very indirect way, usually, what they actually did, and tears,
Mhm.
and then they get a standing ovation for it, and then it's like, okay, back to business as usual, right?
Mhm.
It's just like the tragedy of that. And I think these are all examples, I think, of just how embedded this ritual is, not even like in the church, but like politically, socially, at the individual relationship level. Like, actually, just as we're talking, I'm realizing the scale of this, that if only it were that easy to feel truly sorry and say it, and then that would be it. I think we would be seeing a lot of movement forward in terms of healing and reconciliation, but it doesn't work like that. Um,
It doesn't work without changing political structures. One's heart might be strangely moved, and
yeah.
that's okay, that's fine. But without, political and economic redistribution, there's no way these kinds of systems can be untangled.
This is a little bit more niche in your book, but I did find this concept fascinating, so I wanted to talk about it. You talked about witnessing to pain and trauma actually working like a resurrection. And I really found that fascinating. Can you talk about that and what was going on for you when you arrived at this? Because we've talked about the dangers of bearing witness, but you do seem to think that it's possible for it to also work in such a way that people would experience almost like a resurrection or healing, or so yeah, talk a little bit about that, please.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is, I'm talking about witnessing to atrocity, right? In this book, I'm not talking about individual healing. So I'm actually quite critical of that idea that bearing witness to one's pain in the context of a political atrocity or genocide is going to give rise to resurrection. I was actually very critical of it. I was citing authors who were uncritical of it. And I think this goes back to Augustine of Hippo. Remember Augustine, who's spending all this time, like, kind of dwelling upon his wounds, and he
Right.
finds within his wounds this source of grace, this abundant source of grace. Like, the more pained he is and the more self-scrutinizing he is about his own miserable condition as a sinner, the more he experiences God's grace, right? And I think that there's something similar that's going on actually in trauma theory. And I think about somebody like Kathy Carruth, who is one of the great trauma theorists. She's a literary and cultural critic, and she wrote a bunch of books on trauma theory. And her argument is that trauma is, in fact, that which unites us, right? And so, you know, it's what crosses bridges between people of vastly different cultures and experiences and so on. It is the human condition. And she believes that by articulating our trauma and bringing it to the surface once again, that we are going to experience this moment of resurrection. We're going to be healed, and we're going to be sort of united across difference. And I really want to just deconstruct that idea for a variety of reasons, and mainly because of the differential between people's experience of trauma. So when we talk about trauma, the wound, right, in Greek, literally wound, um, I think we should be very cautious about speaking about it as a universal experience, right? Of course, everybody has had experience of pain and suffering, but if this becomes a political idea, it has the effect of undermining the vast material differences between, my personal experience and that of somebody who is living abjectly in an experience of war, genocide, occupation, and so on. And so the example that I give in the book is Didier Fassin, who is an anthropologist, and he is a physician as well. And he did work looking at Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And in his ethnographic work, he noticed that, MSF has to stay neutral politically. It can't take sides one way or the other. And it uses the language of trauma in order to address situations of injustice and suffering. So if somebody can prove that they've experienced trauma, they may receive some sort of form of, support or intervention from MSF, right? Humanitarian intervention from MSF and other organizations. So he was working, he's studying in Palestine, and he was doing this ethnographic work in Palestine. And there would be people who experienced, yes, terror and fear on the Israeli side and would speak to trauma. And then there were the Palestinians who were experiencing, constant, military assault and victimization, who would also speak of trauma. But there was no way, because there was no material analysis about this trauma, to differentiate these two claims. These two claims were sort of relativized, right? And so this is my huge problem with trauma language. Yes, people all experience pain. Do we necessarily want to make trauma a political category? To the extent that we actually only recognize suffering today, it seems, if we can make a claim to trauma.
Yeah. Yes, I found that point very helpful, right? To provide an analogy, in public school, there's funding for certain diagnoses, but not for others.
Right.
So there's at times, when a child is going through a process of diagnosis, in order to get supports in the classroom, if there's an autism diagnosis, then funding and educational assistance can be provided. But if there are other needs, there's not funding. And so it's like, at times there's literally like, well, if we can get the autism diagnosis, maybe we can sort of bend towards that in order to get funding. And I see that example that you gave, it being similar. Like, if you can be convincing enough that you've undergone trauma, then there's supports for you. But if not, then there isn't, right, going to be. And the politicization of it. And I wrestle with this. Let me dial back first. I laughed because I'm like, my fascination with that concept, and me maybe misreading or just missing the fact that you were critiquing it, probably bespeaks like white male theologian problems, right? Like that like, oh, that's so fascinating, by like, dwelling on my trauma and like, confessing to stuff that I would experience a sort of resurrection. It's like, that is a risk, and how it's not even just been politicized, like it's almost been commodified as well. I mean, it's not totally problematic that a lot of the research being done is where, we're situated, right? Like it is helpful research, and I don't want to downplay the value of it, and I don't want to downplay the trauma of people who have not been in contexts like that. I teach a lot of therapy students, and they talk about, pain, suffering, trauma not being a zero-sum game. And we don't compare traumas, but I also feel like you're pointing out in a very critical way of like, and yet we also have to pay attention to the particularities of suffering and trauma in order to be able to deal with it in a healthy and responsible way. And I don't often hear that conversation, because it's typically spoken of from our context, which just hasn't been through some of these really, really like unspeakably awful situations of genocide and suffering, and for such sustained periods of time. So it really is, for me, walking this tightrope of, yes, the universality of it, that there is something about undergoing, trauma, and research been done, early on, of like the trauma experienced by survivors of domestic abuse was similar to people who had been in Vietnam. So there is something that is similar, but we also have to pay close attention to the particularities of it. So this isn't so much of a question, but just a comment for your consideration of like, how do we hold both of these things of, there does seem to be commonalities, and it can be a slippery slope comparing, but also not getting into particularities can run into precisely the sorts of things that you're pointing out and my student pointed out, which I'm like, yeah, I didn't think about that, but you're totally right. And where's the research being done within these particular contexts, and how might that actually lead us to a broader and deeper understanding of how to really deal with this topic, which is burgeoning and to a certain extent a buzzword, but to deal with it in a healthier and more responsible way.
Right. So first of all, I want to say that I'm not in any way, denying the importance of psychotherapeutic approaches to trauma.
I wasn't
No.
suggesting that.
No,
Yeah.
no, no, no. But I want to be
Yeah. It's good to go
abundantly
on
clear.
record.
But I want to be abundantly clear in that it's been helpful to countless people to talk about, trauma and addressing trauma, and speaking one's trauma has been important, you know, um, exercise for many people for the sake of their own healing. So I don't want to deny that. My book is looking at a very particular problem. It's looking at the problem of witnessing and the ways in which trauma gets used, right? And so my argument is that often there are like these mitigating and reductive forces which take trauma and they use it for the sake of certain kinds of nationalist or racist or colonial projects, right? So I'm not denying the trauma of residential school survivors, but I am concerned about the ways in which the nation state of Canada uses that trauma, right, to create Indigenous subjects whose lives have to be intervened in a certain way, right? Or the ways in which the Canadian public, as a result, perceives Indigenous experience. That it views it simply as a past phenomenon, that of residential school survivors, and doesn't recognize the ongoing colonial apparatuses that are at work within our country. And when I talk about particularity in terms of the differentials of trauma, what I really want to talk about is political economy and colonization, right? So it is one thing to talk about our trauma within the relatively safe context of, non-Indigenous, even white settler experience here in Canada. But trauma is a very different kind of phenomenon and has to be married to an analysis that's, anti-capitalist and anti-colonialist, anti-racist, in order for us to get any traction on that concept. So, when I think about Frantz Fanon's work, for example, Fanon was a psychiatrist. He was also a political revolutionary, right? He saw the deep connection between personal and political trauma. He sees the ways in which colonization works upon the psyche of the individual and creates trauma of a specific kind. And he believes that we have to have both an uprooting of, those forces that create the trauma and individual psychotherapeutic approaches in order to address that complex interrelationship between the political and the personal. And without that, then trauma simply becomes another commodity, as you say, or it becomes an apparatus which the government is able to use against its own people.
Yeah. Yeah, the way that you frame that, it makes me think about Foucault's history of sexuality, and
Of
basically the
course.
point that he makes about sexuality is like, oh, we're so repressed, we're so repressed. He's like, actually, there's a whole heap of encouragement now for us to like drag our sexuality and like into the public sphere, and perform it and speak about it and have it analyzed. And that may not necessarily be amazing, right? Like
Yeah,
it
yeah.
may actually, just be the types of structures we're talking about. Be like, oh yeah, we can work with that too. We
Yeah,
can we can harness that power. We can monetize. We can discipline it. Great. It's like actually, not everything is meant to be dragged into the light and inspected with cameras rolling, right?
right. Right.
Yeah.
Except maybe genocides. But yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Um, but
But
also,
just getting back to Foucault for one moment, you're spot on. Foucault is throughout this book, and just the idea that we think of something that's so immediate, our truest selves being our sexual selves, or that to which we testify. And Foucault alerted us to the ways in which these powers were at work, even in what we think to be the most immediate discursive expressions of ourselves, right? The most authentic expressions of ourselves. So I may confess to my trauma. It's why I kind of balked at your question, who is Jane Barter at the beginning, right? Because I just find it a manufactured. I always give a very manufactured answer, like I don't know, you probably know better, because we create these selves, and the world operates on us to create a certain self. And I'm not really very confident in my own presumption that I know who I am, right? Which is both Augustinian and Foucauldian, by the way.
hmm, mhm. Well, yeah, and Kierkegaardian as well. I mean, maybe I'm projecting there with the Kierkegaard, but just last week I was reading Kierkegaard with students, and I've been thinking a lot about his thought that the biggest problem is the desire to not want to be oneself, and not in a sense of like, oh, just figure out who you really are and then become that. No, the self that God envisioned when God created you, and the 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 life that we are called to live, the self that we are called to be and become, that God envisions, but we didn't envision, and we may not actually like what God envisioned. But
Right.
that's that, like, coming to the place where you take that leap of faith to be like, actually, I think that if it were up to me, I would probably not actually know and be able to know, and I probably wouldn't be very satisfied once I created it anyway. So I'm going to take a leap of faith for God to tell me who I am. I find that so refreshing. I just ask it as a way of because I'm always interested in what people say what to that question. So when you ask someone to say who are you and what do people need to know about you, and typically you get the list of, oh, I teach here or I work here and this is what I do, but what's really interesting when is usually what follows the more personal stuff. I want to move to one question regarding the remnant, and then I want to create some space to talk about Israel and Palestine, because I know that you've done a lot of work in this area, and I know that it is such a politicized topic, but I think it's so important, and I want to create some space in our conversation for you to talk about that. But I before we get there, I want to talk about the remnant, because I felt like that was also really illuminating in the sense of there are people who get a chance to speak, survivors, but then there are the people who don't survive, or there are the people who don't get a chance to speak, and those are the remnant. Um, and you say if I'm reading you correctly, that their witness is actually just as, if not more important. And even I think was it Primo Levi and others who pointed this out too, like just we're the ones who got through, and the things that we had to do in order to survive, like we're living with
Yeah.
the reality of that. There were people who didn't make it through, and their testimonies don't get this airtime, but in a certain way they do speak, but they
Right.
speak from silence and darkness and like the margins of our view and our and just like where we are now.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
The dead speak. The
Yeah.
dead speak. And, Walter Benjamin would go so far as to say that this is an ontological supposition, in the sense that, the dead, the tradition of the oppressed, as he spoke of, exert a kind of ontological pressure upon us. This is the weak messianic witness, that we're to bear witness to these people who have been forgotten. You think about the massive heaps of corpses that he talks about in his thesis on the philosophy of history, and they exert a kind of pressure upon us. And I want to be the kind of theologian or political actor who attends foremost to that pressure, to their speaking, right?
And what is that like, practically speaking? Because I think this is like a helpful off ramp into discussions of Israel and Palestine, because I know that you have done research and you've done presentations and so forth, and you've been quite outspoken, and yet you have not necessarily experienced reception, right? Like, people are afraid to touch this topic, not just in the conversation at the dinner table, but even within academia, there's a real fear of engaging this.
And
Are you
within the
okay
church, and
within
within
the
the
church as
church,
well? Yeah.
especially within the church, like I am an Anglican priest. I have not been active for the past 2 years precisely because of its silence.
When you say not active, is that something that you chose to do yourself, or somebody asked you to not be active because you
I
were
have
speaking about them?
chosen so because I cannot serve at this time I cannot serve a church um, that is silent on this genocide.
Wow.
Yeah.
And on the academic side of things, how has it been?
Well, I must say that, like, in the secular world, it's been great. Like, I teach in a secular academy. My colleagues are in cultural studies for the most part. And, we've had beautiful reading groups. We've, done a lot of thinking and activism, supporting the encampment and so on around Palestine. And that has been wonderful. Like, it's been a place of great refuge for me. Within theology, not so much. I have a handful of colleagues who've been great whom I've worked with closely, but it doesn't seem to be a priority among theologians.
W- Why do you think that is?
Well, going back to the mainline church question, is the historical complicity of the Anglican Church in and the churches in general in the genocide in crafting. For example, the Balfour Declaration and the church's role within that, its early involvement in like the settler colonization of Palestine. That's partly it. But it's also because I think the church has overcorrected in terms of its, response to the Shoah, to the degree that it feels that it has drunk the Kool-Aid that any critique of Israel is anti-Semitic.
Hmm.
Now, not universally. There have been lots of really good examples, and I believe the churches have come a long way in the past 2 years since the genocide in Gaza began. But yeah, no, I think that it's partly their guilt over the Shoah and their desire not to alienate their Jewish interlocutors.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also just the fear of like, okay, well, actually, like, I'm seeing this, and I see a problem here, and I feel like something needs to be said, but fear of being labeled, fear of getting in trouble, fear of losing job, fear of losing opportunity, like it, the fear is real, and I've felt it myself in the sense of like I've had people ask me to comment on it, you know, through this show or like on social media. And um I really wrestled with how to talk about it. But I I don't know if I spoke about it in the right way, and however you speak about it, it feels like you never say everything that you want to say, or say it in a way that you feel satisfied with it. But just the tightrope that I felt like I was walking with it, and the consequences of it. And at a certain point, though, just saying, well, what does it matter if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul in the process? And we did talk about, dragging everything into light and putting things on camera. And what, what mystifies me, what scares me, what angers me, what saddens me is the fact that you can now, the way that media is gone, you can show footage, but people either don't believe it, like they don't believe their own eyes anymore, or they, quite frankly, respond with a sort of what about, or don't care enough to really go deeper and ask questions. And So this is the climate that you try to speak into, and really try to love your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is. Um, but so that's why I'm asking these questions, because I'm not sure the average person is aware of just the dynamics that are at play in our churches, or in academic context, because oftentimes, because there's such a fear of speaking up about it, then the people who are talking loudest just get to talk as if there's just one default view, right? Like we should all just be totally on board with what Israel is doing. And if you do raise any questions about it, then you must be anti-Semitic, or you must not, be a faithful Christian. And so what does it mean to bear witness to what's going on? And what does it mean to be a dissenting voice, even if it might cost you something? This is why I'm bringing this not up, not to sort of like get the tea spilled, but actually to like just put this out there and create a space for us to have a conversation about it.
Mhm, mhm. So what specifically would you like to know?
Um, Well, you have space. What do you want people to know? You got
Mm.
space to say it. What do you want people to hear?
Okay, sure. So, for a very long time, 76 years or so, there has been this ethno-nationalist project that has been taking place, in which, the state of Israel has ethnically cleansed systematically, um, Palestine and Palestinians. And, the nadir for me has taken place over the past 2 years, since October 7th, 2023. And by very conservative estimates alone, we don't know, over 100,000 people, that's very conservative estimates, have been slaughtered, 50% of whom are children. These are innocent people. These are people who have no advocates, really, because the powerful people of this world has been enamored with the state of Israel in the West. I think that that is changing, and I think that the church especially has to do a reckoning about this. It has to do a reckoning because of its historical involvement in Palestine, in which the Church of England, for example, was fundamental to the project of early Zionism. Christian Zionism, by the way, precedes Zionism, Jewish Zionism, as an ideological and historical thing. That the church has to come to a reckoning about how it can possibly turn away from these this heap of corpses that is piling up in Palestine, and show absolutely no concern, and that it uses its own biblical texts in such a way to justify the slaughter of innocent people, including Christians. I mean, I don't think we should just be interested in Christians as Christians, obviously, but the fact that, there are so many Christian Zionists who don't seem to care at all about the fact that Christianity is almost extinct in Gaza, to me, strikes me as, at the very least, hypocritical. So the process, to me, it seems, is to become educated about the Nakba, become educated about the difference between, Judaism and Zionism. The process, I think, also involves finding ways to show support of Palestine eventually, and of Palestinians eventually, getting involved in boycotts and divestments and sanctions, getting involved in marches and protests, and using our voices in the way that we used our voices when apartheid was taking place in South Africa. That's just the beginning of what I would say.
Well, thank you for taking the time to say that, and thank you for your witness. Um, I just I appreciate not only the words, but also the actions that you're taking, um, to sort of move beyond just performance, but actually your very real concrete commitment. It bears witness to me, and I just really value your perspective and what you're doing. So
Thank you
thank
so much. We are
yeah.
having a conference. Can I give it a plug? We
Yes.
are we are having a conference. This will be the second conference on the call for repentance that was issued by Palestinian Christians at the beginning of the genocide. And this call for repentance conference is taking place actually in Winnipeg in the middle of May. And you can email me if you want any details about that.
Yeah, if you send me the information, I'll make sure it's in the show notes and in the Substack and all that so people can check it out. Is there going to be a streamed option?
I don't think so. We didn't do that last year, partly because these conversations are very, very delicate.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's but if you go to Winnipeg, Jane can show you around.
You won't regret it.
You won't regret it. Okay. Well, yeah, if you send me that info, I'll make sure that it gets out there.
Beautiful.
All
okay.
Right.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for your
much for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.